Hey everyone, and welcome to This Explainer. Today we're going to do something kind of wild. We're bridging two completely unexpected worlds to uncover a really fascinating hidden truth about power. We're looking at exactly how subcultures, whether we're talking about musicians on a stage or political activists out in the streets, somehow manage to survive when a massive, overarching authority tries to control, consume, or just outright eliminate them.
I know, it sounds like an impossible comparison, right? Picture this. A glitter-wearing, ultra-theatrical rock star from the 1970s on one side and a modern political protester staring down futuristic police drones on the other. On the surface, you'd think they share absolutely nothing in common. But stick with me here, because by the end of this explainer, you'll see exactly how cultural rebellion connects directly to literal, physical protest. Because the truth is, both of these groups use the exact same underlying strategies to keep their identities alive against the dominant system.
Okay, let's jump right into Section 1, the War of Position, focusing on Antonio Gramsci's theory of cultural negotiation.
So to really get how power operates in society, we first need to look at this brilliant concept coined by the Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci. He argued that power isn't just about physical force or violence. It's actually more like an ongoing, evolving cultural battlefield. Underdog groups have to constantly adapt to survive being totally swallowed up by the mainstream. He called this the war of position. Think about it, like when a gritty, raw, underground punk aesthetic suddenly ends up being commodified and sold in high-end shopping malls. That's the mainstream trying to consume the subculture. To survive that, the underdog can't just stand still. They have to actively change their tactics, shift their symbols, and completely rewrite their narrative just to stay alive and slip out of the mainstream's grasp.
That takes us to Section 2, Glam Rock's cultural survival, evading the mainstream.
Now, most people probably think of glam rock as just this short-lived, sparkly trend from the 70s. But a really fascinating semiotic analysis by scholar Mara Priscello shows how it actually survived for decades. How? By constantly reinventing its own myth to avoid commercial neutralization. Back in the 1970s, acts like David Bowie and T-Rex leaned into cosmic escapism. They were these starmen, defying social norms through pure, glittery alien theater. But, eventually, that sound and look became heavily mainstream. So to keep their outsider identity, the subculture had to pivot. By the 1980s, bands like Hanoi Rocks mixed that glamorous aesthetic with gritty, street-level darkness and punk nihilism. The escape wasn't about flying into outer space anymore. It became this necessary defense mechanism, retreating into a dangerous underground world where the polished pop industry just couldn't follow them. And then, in December 1984, Hanoi Rocks drummer Razzle was killed in a devastating car crash, and this crash was caused by the singer of Motley Crue, a band that, at the time, totally represented massive, soulless commercial success. For the glam subculture, this wasn't just a tragic traffic accident. It was rapidly woven right into their deep mythology as a powerful metaphor. The narrative shifted. Now, the pure, authentic underground artist was literally and physically crushed by a careless, bloated mainstream. It became this defining story of martyrdom that fiercely reinforced their identity as the true outsiders.
This whole ideological battle really peaked in the 1990s when grunge music blew up out of Seattle. Grunge bands were wearing thrift store flannels, singing about realistic depression, feeling down in a hole, right? And they positioned themselves as the only real artists, labeling glam as entirely fake. Suddenly, glam bands in LA were the ultimate outcasts in the music industry. So how did they fight the war of position? They recoded their narrative entirely. If grunge was going to be all about rain clouds and misery, glam doubled down on sparkles and celebration. They basically decided that choosing joy, theatricality, and celebrating life, even when you're flat broke and rejected, was actually the ultimate tactical move. It was a highly authentic rebellion against a deeply depressing era.
Singer Jesse Malin actually captured this era perfectly with the phrase, glitter in the gutter. It wasn't about trying to be mainstream rock stars anymore. It was literally about finding beauty, defiance, and human dignity when the world has completely cast you aside. They kept their makeup, they kept their defiance, but they shifted their symbols so the dominant culture couldn't erase them. And that right there, that is the absolute essence of a cultural war of position.
Moving right along to Section 3, adapting to the enemy, from semiotics to state power.
Okay, so we've seen how musicians masterfully changed their symbols and narratives to survive cultural erasure, but how does this translate when the stakes are literal, physical freedom? We're now pivoting to our second source, which is a really deep sociological study on modern political protesters and police video surveillance by researchers Philip Knoop and Peter Ulrich. This takes the war of position completely out of the underground concert hall and drops it directly onto the city streets.
Which brings us to Section 4, the panopticon at protests, video surveillance and social control.
When protesters step onto the street, they face a completely different dominant force attempting to manage their behavior, the state, acting through the police. And one of the most powerful tools the modern state uses? The camera. The state uses video surveillance to create what's called a panopticon effect. Imagine a circular prison, right? There's a single guard tower right in the middle with mirrored windows. The prisoners can never see inside the tower, so they never know exactly when they're being watched. And because they might be observed at any given second, they end up policing themselves. They literally become their own guards. That kind of psychological control is exactly what the state attempts to achieve with protest surveillance.
The belief in this invisible control is actually so strong that back in 1983, the German Constitutional Court issued a famous legal ruling on it. They explicitly stated that the mere presence of a police camera would terrify people into total conformity, effectively destroying democratic protest because no one would want to stand out. But, just like the mainstream music industry trying to easily consume a subculture, the dominant power rarely gets the simple obedience it expects.
See, modern policing doesn't just point a camera and hope everyone gets scared and goes home. They use highly calculated, selective strategies. They gather massive amounts of information before these events even happen, and they use video feeds to classify crowds into distinct threat levels, like green, yellow, or red. They also use this video to intentionally delay arrests until after a protest is over, specifically to avoid sparking mass riots right in the moment. The whole goal is this clean, psychological game where they try to convince the so-called good protesters to self-police and actively push out the bad ones.
All right, Section 5, different spectrums, different reactions. How protesters perceive the camera.
So when researchers went in and interviewed multiple groups across the political spectrum, they found out something fascinating. A camera is never just a camera. The reaction to it depends entirely on a group's worldview. As an impartial explainer, let's look at how the study breaks this down. Left-wing groups generally view the state as repressive, so they see the police camera as a tool for illegitimate criminalization and unwarranted data gathering. Right-wing groups, on the other hand, tend to view the current state as damaged, but fundamentally see the police as protectors. They dislike the camera being pointed at themselves, but enthusiastically want it used against their political opponents. Liberal groups generally trust the state and view the camera positively, seeing it as neutral protection from violence. And interestingly, football ultras who aren't traditionally political at all actually share the left's view of the police as an opponent and see the camera as an illegitimate attack on their fan culture.
And this brings us right to the absolute crux of the study. Remember the courts in 1983? They thought people would experience simple deterrence, that they'd just get terrified of the cameras and stop protesting altogether. But they don't. Instead, activists undergo what sociologists call subjectification. Honestly, that's just a fancy way of saying they learn the rules of the game and then change their behavior to outsmart the referee. Just like glam rockers adapting to a shifting music industry, these protesters learn exactly what banners, chants, or outfits are going to trigger the police cameras, and they play a highly tactical game right out there on the street.
To maintain their agency, these diverse groups innovate really robust security cultures. If the police want to use cameras to identify individuals, well, the subculture responds by wearing identical clothing, hats, and masks to blend into one unrecognizable single mass. And if the police use cameras from above to dominate, the protesters deploy surveillance, which is surveillance from below. Picture this, a heavily armored line of riot police holding up cameras met instantly by a line of protesters holding up their own smartphones, filming right back. They are neutralizing the state's tool and fighting a modern war of position right there on the pavement.
Finally, let's wrap up with Section 6, the never-ending struggle. Resistance just changes shape.
In both the cultural and political spheres, the dominant power is in a state of constant negotiation with the underdog. Power is never a one-way street, and it is absolutely never absolute. Whether it's a glam rocker putting on theatrical makeup to defy a soulless mainstream industry, or a protester putting on a uniform mask to defy a police drone, the war of position proves that subcultures will always innovate a way to survive. The underdog doesn't just give up. The specific methods change, the aesthetics evolve, but the core human struggle for identity, meaning, and resistance, that just keeps going.
So, as we close out this explainer, I want you to think about this. You are constantly negotiating with dominant forces every single day, whether you realize it or not. From how you choose to dress at the office, to how you navigate those tricky social media algorithms, to how you express your deepest beliefs in a crowded room. Take a look around you today. Where is the war of position playing out in your own daily life? Keep your eyes open, and I promise you, you're going to see the resistance everywhere. Thanks for joining me.